Hi, I'm Liz Litteral. I am one of the board members of Students for Civic Impact, and we are happy to be here today with our student advisors and our faculty to talk about some current events and get their thoughts on what we can expect in the near future, as well as the long distance future on current events. Ed, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes. Yes, thank you, Liz. Hello, everyone. My name is Ed Benight, and I am also a board member with the Students for Civic Impact.
And I'm Felix. I'm a rising junior from California, and I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board.
I'm Layla, and I'm a rising college freshman, and I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board.
Hi, I'm Rashika. I'm a rising college freshman at Pitt, and I'm also a member of the Student Advisory Board.
And I'm Chris, and I just graduated from UMD, and I'm also a member on the Student Advisory Board.
Is that everyone for Student Advisory Board who's here? Awesome. I'd like to introduce our faculty next, and we'll start with Dr. McCuan.
Hello, everyone. My name is David McCuan. I'm a professor of political science at Sonoma State University. And my PhD is in political economy, and I focus on two areas, American elections or electoral behavior, and also on international relations, particularly on political violence. It's a pleasure to join you all.
Thank you, Dr. McCuan. Dr. Sakiev?
Hi, everybody. My name is Azamat Sakiev, and I am also a political scientist. I teach at Santa Rosa College out in California. There are a number of us here from California. And my graduate degree was in international relations and comparative politics subfields. So global politics, and within that specialization on democratization in post-Soviet, or what was known as kind of the Russian area geographically. And nice to see everybody, colleagues and students.
Wonderful. We'll go ahead and start with our first panelist, Dr. McCuan, and Felix will be moderating this discussion.
So first I want to talk about just like the general scheme of how the federal government is operating under the Trump administration. And given layoffs and long wait times reaching different federal departments, what can we expect in the near future? And is the federal government functioning right now?
Thank you for your question. It's nice to see you and nice to see everyone here today. If you look at what has happened in less than 170 days in Trump 2.0, they've been moving fast and deep in terms of making changes and moving legislation forward. Obviously, that's the big, beautiful bill, which was high risk, high reward for them. So that's a major victory for them. But there's kind of downstream effects. There's effects that take place over a couple of years. And one thing to pay attention to kind of in the near term is what happens at the federalism level. You know, the United States is a country that really doesn't like government. We have over 83,000 governments, right? This is everything from school districts to state governments to county governments, towns, counties, municipalities, and so forth. But with a lot of government, the Trump administration is going to push down a lot of responsibilities. We've seen this before in the Reagan Revolution under what was called new federalism, new federalism, the Nixon administration with new federalism, and that challenges how well government can run. So with a lot of government and a lot of uncertainty, just as kind of a reminder, there's three fundamental rules of American politics, right? Fiscal stress. There's never enough money to do what we ask the public sector to do. That's framed by uncertainty, and that's framed by discretion or judgment. And if you're pushing uncertainty, that's something that can be uneven, especially down ballot or downstream, if you will. And that's going to pick up here over the next, say, year to year and a half.
And beyond whether or not the government is functioning at all, is it functioning fairly? Are there sufficient checks and balances? And how are modern day policies and legal implementations differing from other times in U.S. history? And what practices have stayed the same or remained consistent?
Sure, great question, broad question. If you look at how the founders designed the American democracy, it was designed with a fundamentally kind of counter opposites or kind of polar opposites conditions, right? You've got liberty or freedom on one hand, you've got equality on the other hand. Usually we think of liberty and freedom as ascribed to the Republican Party, usually equality to the Democratic Party, but those things clash. You see this in terms of civil rights and civil liberties. You see this in terms of protests and upset. But that is also framed by institutional rules. So if you're in the minority, and you might think of as protections, and I don't mean like ethnic minority, if you're out of the mainstream or not in the minority of public opinion, majority versus minority rules, there should be certain protections for you. But there are also pretty limited protections, and you see this most recently in terms of how Congress operates. Because Democrats are in the minority or don't own the House, they're in the minority in the Senate. That's not a good place to be because you can't do a lot of things. And so while we have these protections in principle, in point of fact, in terms of how they actually operate, the on-the-ground reality is minority protections don't go very far. And it's part of that fundamental friction that the founders designed, in which a system would be expansive on one hand, that's equality, and limited on the other in terms of freedom and what you see. And that's certainly in clash today. And the Trump administration pushes that envelope a long, long way.
Can I add something? So I think David is an Americanist, and it's obviously very American take, but there's the comparative perspective that I think is very important to keep in mind. How large is the American government, right? The expectation in the United States usually just hinges on a singular look at the US government. But if you compare it to the rest of the world, American federal government is extremely small. It's big in terms of absolute numbers of dollars it operates with, right? The budgets. But in terms of how much it touches the lives of individual Americans, 85% of our daily life is regulated at state level. It never goes beyond it, right? So the federal government, in terms of regulating our lives, is comparatively speaking small. And that's something that I think is a lot of the time lost on the Americans when we analyze it. So if you pivot to your question in terms of is the federal government functioning or not, we have to take into account this responsibility of the federal government that it has over us, which is very small comparatively. And if you kind of look from that perspective, you can argue that the US federal government is seemingly non-functional because of its role is so limited when it comes to kind of regulating our behavior, daily behavior. A little bit of a comparative perspective here.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up on that just for a minute, one thing that we pay attention to at the state level, local level, and at the federal level that's in common there, Felix, is budgets. Budgets are a proxy for values. So one important thing that you would see in a class for Azamat, Dr. Sakiev, or myself, is another political scientist, is we pay attention to how budgets align priorities. So when you look at the Trump administration, you want to know what they believe. When you look at the Biden administration or the Obama administration, you want to see what they believe. You look at where they put their money, what budgets look like. You do that the same thing locally, and you do that at the statewide level. It's a great shortcut or proxy for what politicians believe and what their value set is looking at budgets.
So let's move on to some recent policy concerns, and mostly about some constitutional issues regarding executive orders signed by President Trump. What constitutional issues could limiting birthright citizenship pose, and could that result in a constitutional crisis?
Fabulous question. All right. So if you look at the post-Civil War amendments, these are the amendments passed in the wake of the very deadly, controversial, difficult national conscience that breaks in the Civil War. And you look at those post-Civil War amendments, they're arguably the most important amendments of the Constitution. We often talk about, freedom of press, freedom of speech, but the post-Civil War amendments, particularly the amendment that includes birthright citizenship, also talks about equal protection and due process under the law. This is how we extend the Bill of Rights to the states. And we have still not really rectified this from the founding of the country through the Civil War, through events of 9/11 or January 6, 2021. And so when you have an executive order that undoes a previous executive order, something for the Trump administration that he signs that undoes something from, say, the Biden administration, that has very strong constitutional prerogative and protection in terms of separation of powers. The courts, the Supreme Court has backed that. But when you attack a fundamental constitutional right, and we have a recent case involving this with the Supreme Court. When you're looking at a constitutional right, the court stepped around that issue because birthright citizenship or any other examples that take on fundamentally something like equal protection, due process of the law, birthright citizenship stand a much higher test. And so the court is going to have to revisit this particular issue on birthright citizenship because they skirted around it. And now today, they have been talking about, especially in the wake of passing the big, beautiful bill, things like denaturalization. Denaturalization means removing the citizenship from those that have been extended citizenship. And citizenship is a property right. And what I mean by that is not that you own property, but you have access to the franchise of citizenship and all the protections therein. And that's a really, really big deal. So birthright citizenship as a concept, if you're allowed to do that, opens up a Pandora's box of what the unitary executive or executive power could unleash on folks, including things like denaturalization or removing citizenship from those that have been naturalized.
And talking about the Supreme Court as well as these checks and balances, has the increased use of the shadow or emergency docket by the Roberts Court, has that resulted in there being less checks on the executive, or has it been somewhat of a wash and not affecting how the government is checked?
Yeah, so the use of alternative mechanisms like the rocket docket or the use of the shadow docket or the use of components that could alter what the court does is huge. Presidents have this role as well. We often talk about like presidential vetoes or statements and presidents have things called signing statements, where signing statements can also set forth policy. So there are actually a lot of mechanisms that you get or that you see happen by the court and by the presidents or the office of the president that aren't exactly on that old cartoon of how a bill becomes a law or these other kind of characterizations or stereotypes that we see. These things are part of an informal and formal set of powers, and they do expand executive power and limit or can expand the power of the court. And remember that the court has a fundamental currency, and that's the currency of legitimacy. If the court isn't approved or seen as legitimate, then it can't order liberty. And notice the oxymoronic kind of component of that. You're ordering liberty, you're ordering freedom. And so there's this legitimacy of the court and how the court operates. It has to have that currency, and at the same time, it has to order liberty. And so the way it can do that is it can sidestep some of these questions through things like the rocket docket or other mechanisms that allow it to change its kind of operating condition. The fundamental point there, Felix, is that courts are political. And we often learn that, oh, the law, oh, there's this exalted thing that's the law that comes down as like manna from heaven. No, the courts are political, and that means the law is political. And that means if you talk to someone who's lacking citizenship, or someone who's been had to interact with the popo, or somebody who's had to actually has been brown, or a woman, somebody like that, they know that the law is political, and it's kind of unveiling of that, I think, and unleashing that has also been an important element here of what's going on in terms of how the court and this administration is operating.
Moving to another topic that might be decided by the courts, there's been some speculation about Donald Trump potentially running for a third term. The 22nd Amendment prohibits any president from serving more than 2 terms or being elected to more than 2 terms. And could we ever see that amendment being overturned, or is there another way that Donald Trump may try to secure a third term?
It doesn't appear likely for a variety of reasons. One is that there are a lot of folks that talk about suspending elections or expanding what has happened, with the National Guard or with federal troops across the country, and that this could slowly ebb out. And this kind of doomsday of democracy kind of effect is great theater. It's a pretty cool thing to talk about in the media. But the likelihood of this happening is really difficult. There are still a number of structural barriers that prevent that. You're not likely to see constitutional change. Could you see a declaration of a national emergency, the advent of martial law, these types of things? I don't see that type of thing. And this is partly the rhetoric of when Donald Trump says things that are outrageous, people go crazy. The same thing happens when Hillary Clinton says things. The same thing happens when Barack Obama says things. There is this kind of extension of running with this, but the likelihood of that is less. I would add two things. One is I think we should hear from my colleague about this from a comparative perspective, because I think that would be important. And at the same time, I think you also have to remember that what the president is a loyalist, and that means he's a loyalist for his family. So you can't rule out family members as a result of running or trying to take over. There is that kind of component, and that speaks to a number of issues that may not be constitutional, but are highly, highly political. Azamat, yeah, I wanted to say, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, this discussion of the terms in the U.S. presidential politics, it's quite interesting because U.S. presidential terms, 2 terms, 4 years each, is actually, again, one of the shorter terms out there. And we're talking about comparative cases, right? We're not talking about dictatorships where, leaders stay forever. But even in comparative democracies, United States executive serves one of the shortest terms. And the broader set of this, beyond what's going on right now with Trump, and there's this alarm whether or not Trump can stay in power. But there is this broader discussion whether the United States should actually maybe extend, right, in general, not pertaining to Trump, but in general, perhaps extend the terms by a year or two, or maybe, in Britain, for example, or in Germany, it's not unusual for their chief executive to serve for more than a decade. And the discussion there generally is that to implement the agenda, maybe an executive leader that comes with an agenda should have more than just 4 years, right? Very often, or 8 years at a time. So if I think that kind of a discussion should also be part of this. Those kinds of questions should also be part of the discussion, I think, not necessarily focusing on one particular individual. And maybe there are benefits from extending the terms, either the length of the terms and the number of the terms, when it comes to effective agenda implementation. I know it might be very controversial to suggest anything like that right now. Just the thought of Trump staying for another term or even for another couple of years is beyond everybody. So, but it's an interesting question, and I would invite students to think in a broader term, not just pertaining to Trump in that sense. But students should be aware, I think, that U.S. executive term is one of the shorter ones out there.
So we mentioned it earlier, and it is certainly the elephant in the room in a legislative sense. So just days before the big beautiful bill was passed, provisions authorizing the sale of millions of acres of federal land were withdrawn because it drew such harsh criticism from both parties. With U.S. Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum calling federal lands America's balance sheet, should we expect federal lands to be leased or sold off in the future? And if so, what potential benefits or drawbacks might we see from this?
Thank you for that. Yeah. If you look at what the Trump administration has done, how they've operated, especially the extensive use of executive action, like executive orders they've talked about or that we've all heard about, the way you would handle this is not through statute. You wouldn't put this into the big, beautiful bill because you're going to lose votes, right, in that back and forth. And this bill moves over from the Senate where it's been changed dramatically, contributes to the debt and the deficit, changes a lot of the structure around Medicaid and those cuts. Changes a lot of things around energy generation, things that Secretary Burgum is particularly interested in given his background. And you look at that and you don't want to lose votes. So what you do in the negotiations back and forth with House members is you put forward a commitment to use executive actions to get votes in terms of passing that bill. This is exactly how Republicans get to 218 to pass the bill in the House after you have J.D. Vance, the vice president, cast a vote in the Senate to move it over. And so you would see, Felix, executive actions that would target things. We've seen this already in terms of actions related to California and Point Reyes and what's going on with farmers out in the Point Reyes area. So if you know of parks or national treasures, not just balance sheet components, if you know of national treasures where there are private actors acting. There might be folks that are grazing with land, with cattle, or there might be folks that are looking at minerals or doing things that are on federal lands that involve some type of private right. You would expect that the Trump administration would use executive action to protect those. This wouldn't be the wholesale use of land, but it would be looking out over there at the ocean and going, we can get those mineral deposits. Why are they under the sea? It was those types of elements. And I would think you won't see them slow walking this. You'll see them moving forward there because they also feel emboldened, right? They had this whole legislative program about this one bill. This bill passes. So they're going to double down and move forward. And I think where that component is going to be felt most is through immigration and ICE and the power of DHS, but it's going to have a dramatic spillover effect into other arenas, like the arena of our national treasures, not just our national balance sheet of national parklands.
Dr. Sakiev, did you have any comments on the potential benefits or drawbacks and if we should expect more leasing or sale of federal lands?
I am simply not versed in this debate and discussion between the federal and state land and how I'm not even aware how controversial that is or not. So I wouldn't have any comments on that.
So moving back to the big, beautiful bill, it passed, which is certainly a legislative win for the Trump administration, but it passed in the Senate by razor thin 51-50 margins. What do you think that says about the current political landscape surrounding the houses of Congress and what that says about Trump's agenda?
Yeah, this is a good place to kind of take in total what we're trying to do in this organization and where the United States body politic is at. We're a very divided nation, and this divisiveness spills over to our legislative arena. And you have politicians who are worried, right? You have Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, who's giving up his political career, cast a vote to protect health care for those that are most vulnerable, particularly Medicaid and state level indigent individuals who receive health care. And North Carolina's done a lot of different things to expand health care to its rural populations. He loses his political career, is not going to run again. And the bill ultimately goes the other direction for him. He gave it all up and left it all on the field. And it's that type of high stakes game that President Trump and his team have exposed and have run very well. This also, I think, expresses the difficulty it is to be in the minority. And while all senators are equal and all of them look in the mirror and see themselves as the future president of the United States, nonetheless, these senators are also really worried about the winds of change and the power of Donald Trump. And he owns the Republican Party. And this is also, I think, also very exciting. The passage of the big, beautiful bill gives Democrats an agenda they didn't have. They can talk about healthcare linked with the economy. Young people are often interested in a very high level in the environment and global climate change because it's going to affect them in their lifetimes. They see that as linked to the economy and their economic future. So you take many of these issues, and now Democrats have an agenda they didn't have. And who comes next to run the Republican Party for Donald Trump when he's gone? Or who is the proxy for that? Is that a family member? Is that J.D. Vance? So this 2026 to 2028 period is really exciting because it's wide open. And we have also seen a dramatic impact of Gen Z voters and their disapproval of Donald Trump, and that he's gone down by about 23 points on average because young people are interested in issues. They're not interested in parties. And so who's going to speak to them for their issues moving forward? And that's where I think an organization like this comes into play in terms of doing good work and educating students of all stripes, all views, and in terms of their impact that they can have on the body politic. That's very exciting.
Can I add one thing and maybe even invite Professor McCuan to also opine on this? So we are now completing, I think I read something like the second decade of razor thin margin in the Senate, right? We have not seen a so-called supermajority or even, a 60-40 kind of majority quite a while now. So it seems to be we've stabilized in this razor thin margins in the Senate. Is this kind of, and there's this news of Elon Musk, right, trying to insert a third party. And there have been a number of attempts historically to insert a third party, and they've all failed. The United States is, unabashedly a two-party system. So it makes, coming back to the question, and maybe David, for you to find as well, what this tells about the system is perhaps system is more ready. I'm not sure if it's completely ready, but maybe more ready than at any other point for some sort of a third party to come in, because it doesn't really take much to play the third party role at this point, right? Elon Musk's agenda is that all you need is a couple Senate
Couple
seats and
senates.
then maybe less than 10 seats in the House, and you already have a viable third party, which is not what we usually thought about the third party, this full-blown third party. Maybe that's what it tells about the system right now, right? That it doesn't take, maybe it is time for a third party. It's an interesting proposition. It's just, when you asked the question, it came to my mind that this intransigent kind of situation in the Senate or in the Congress, it also tells us that when, it's a dysfunctional system, some sort of a third party might be coming in to tie the brake or something. So something to think about.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great, I have a lot of thoughts about that. But Felix, I'm going to put it back on you. Do you think there should be a third party? And what would that look like?
I'm not certain exactly what it would look like. I don't. The political landscape after Donald Trump is curious, and I mean the nation is reaching ridiculous levels of polarization, and that's evident from 51 to 50 in the Senate for the big beautiful bill. So I think that if a third party were to emerge, it would likely emerge from the fracturing of the GOP and the Republican Party, and something like Elon Musk's new party seems poised to be that third party, because when Elon Musk got involved with Donald Trump during the campaign, it became clear that there were multiple sects of the Republican Party supporting certain ideals while others did not. And Elon Musk might take some people with him. So I think if there were to be a viable third party in the United States, it would likely be helmed by those people that feel disillusioned by his leaving of the Trump administration and still support the policies that he supports.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at look at Bernie, right? He gets 36,000 people in LA. He gets 33,000 young people in Denver, right? And so there's clearly something for Democrats that I call them the BSers, that Bernie Sanders types aren't like doing, or that are appealing to in the Democratic Party. And you look at Elon and how he's able to carve off just a few people. But what's in common with both of them is not just like money, but like organizations, resources, and endorsements, MORE. And you need money, you do need organizations, you do need resources and endorsements to be successful as a political movement. And political scientists, we love two parties, American political scientists, in terms of like the whole system set up for two parties. We love two parties, and there's going to be a lot of people left out of that. And that's before you get to generational change. And I know Bernie's like old as dirt, but that there's this engagement, right? AOC, the New York City and the mayor's race and what's happening. We are in this place of pivotal change, and Republicans know that, and they were able to use that to advantage in 2024 in the election with Latinos and Latinas, and with African American men. And that we're in this inflection point for demographic change and idea change, along with the cardinal rules of politics, fiscal stress, uncertainty, and discretion playing a role here. And so I think that's what makes it exciting to get involved and to navigate this. But I think, as Azamat and I both know, the rules are stacked against third parties.
Yeah.
And secondarily, the problems are really massive, which drive some of this division.
Do you want to add anything on to the political party discussion on what would a third party look like, or anything like that? And personally, I kind of want to add just my 2 cents on that too.
That's why I kind of threw it out there too, as kind of a little clue. You guys do your thing. Throw it out there.
Rashika and Layla, I want you guys to go first if you want to say anything.
Honestly, I agree with Felix's point. There's no telling on what it would look like, just because we don't know what the aftermath is going to look like after the Trump administration. So I don't really have a 2 cents on it, just because it really is all up in the air if there is a possibility of a third party looming. But I don't think it's completely going to be in control of the younger generation.
Rashika, would you see it as more issue driven, or would you see it as more like a viewpoint driven?
I think it will be issue driven, because I agree with what you said. We don't really focus on what the party's opinions are, what their missions are. We kind of focus on, oh, what the current issue is, how it's impacting us, how it's going to impact our futures, how say in my position right now how we are going to be adults and the economy is sort of crashing down on us at the moment. So I do believe it will be issue driven.
All right.
I think one thing, if I may, just from a comparative perspective, um, David and I would just mention that the rules are stacked, right? It's actually not a coincidence that the United States has only two political parties. It's not an American thing. It's a product of the electoral system we use, which is plurality based, which simply means the election is won in the United States by whoever gets more vote than anybody else. That's simple as that. It's not a majority driven. It's a plurality driven, right? And that kind of electoral systems, no matter where they're used, tend to produce two-party systems. Britain is another example because they use a similar system. But it is when you switch the electoral system to other types, there are many other types, but the other major alternative is something called proportional representation that tends to produce more political parties. So we know that because we're not going to switch the rules anytime soon, that the system is going to be stacked towards a two-party system. But what is possible, in my view, comparatively speaking, is not a third full-blown political party, which would be operating at the same level with Republican and Democratic Party, but a third wheel kind of a political party, similar to what the liberal Dems and
Lib
Democrats in
Dems.
Britain, right? There are conservatives and then there are Labor Party. Those are the Republicans and Democratic equivalent, so to speak, right? Roughly. But they have this third wheel, small political party, which nudges enough seats to be in the parliament and then kind of play the kingmaker. So that kind of a third, quote unquote, political party, I think is possible. And in my view, it may not be issue driven at all. It may be actually personality driven. It may exist if Elon Musk is successful enough. This party may only exist until he has an interest in it. There is this in the third world countries, particularly this personality driven political parties. So it may be issue driven, but whatever it is, but I don't think it's going to be a full blown equal third party, but this smaller party that somehow gets into Congress and can make the weather, so to speak, right? So that would be my prediction. But it's a fascinating period. I mean, as a political scientist, I know it's crazy to say that I'm rooting for Elon Musk on this one, but as a political scientist, I would love to see a semblance of a third political party at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add too, I feel like I have seen the makings of multiple political parties coming about for a while now, probably 10, 15 years at least, with the Tea Party
Yeah.
putting the ideology within the Republican Party way back when. And I think with 2016 with Trump and certain Republicans not wanting him to have the nominee or the nomination and into now, I think we see that division in the Republicans over time. And then on the Democratic side, you're absolutely right. Like the Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton 2016 parties, very different and very distinct. And I think the reason why a lot of people do pick just one is because of that winner take all kind of mentality and that system. You mentioned like 85% of daily life is determined by the state government. I think if we want to have multiple parties, they have to have strength at the local level before they can
Mhm.
a more federal presence. So I think those are some things to consider when we're thinking about beyond the two-party system. And I think that in terms of, the polarity that Felix was mentioning and that razor thin margin, you've got to think also what happens to the vote when you have a third party, when you have a nadir or something on a federal ballot, and what that does to the general vote. So those are all things to
Yeah.
consider. I do want to have one more question for McCuan and Dr. Sakiev, you can address this as well about foreign policy.
So my last question is a broad one. So there have been questions about the United States' role in the world and the future direction of U.S. foreign policy. So what do you think, in a broad sense, are the biggest challenges we are facing ahead?
Okay, there are certain road marks that we've had so far in terms of this administration's approach to American foreign policy, and I'd link that with security policy. Long ago, there was a political scientist named Aaron Wadowski who talked about two presidencies, a domestic presidency and a foreign policy presidency, right? The domestic presidency was messy and partisan. The foreign policy presidency, we went overseas as Americans, right? We weren't divided. But there really is not just a foreign policy presidency and a domestic presidency, there's a security presidency. And the security presidency, particularly post 9/11, has been huge, whether you're Democrat or Republican, a really big deal. And as we look at where things are at, one important road mark was what happened at the Munich Security Conference in February of this year. Later this year, there'll be a Prague Forum 2000 Security Conference where the administration will go further. And what you see there is you see Europeans, you see those from the Asia, Indo-Pacific, you see those from below the equator countries, you see non-aligned movements, you see a number of people that are worried about America's role in the world, regardless of what happens. And that is because the America First process that the Trump administration has put forward is costly for United States legitimacy. Whether we look at what is happening in Ukraine and Russia, future relationships with China, what things look like with India or with tariffs or what we're going to negotiate, there's been this crisis of legitimacy, and serious people in Washington, D.C. understand that this approach has set back American diplomatic policy, how we deal with other countries, by a generation. And that means that it's going to take the next generation to play an important role in making a difference about America's role, because it's going to take that long to catch up based upon the events of just 170 days for what's happened. So it's been hugely consequential. It has really kind of long range effects, and that affects anything in the near term and also the approach, but it also affects our ability to work with other nations. And that's generational. And that's the miss here. I think that is the longer running kind of component that folks haven't paid attention to. The media hasn't covered, academics haven't covered. This is like a pebble that's been dropped into that lake, and it's going to reverberate a long time and take a long time to come back from there.
All right. I'm going to hand it over to Chris now for an interview with Dr. Sakiev.
All right, Dr. Sakiev, so I'll start with the same question. So given this very rapid change in U.S. foreign policy, what kind of challenges can we expect, and what kind of things can we expect to see in the future?
It's one of the most hotly contested questions right now in the field of foreign policy analysis, because it's really curious, right? As we enter the 21st century. So the 20th century has largely been dominated by what is known as traditional security and foreign policy concerns. And by traditional, we usually mean by state-centric. So our foreign policy in the 20th century was largely driven by what's good for the state, right? So and everything the security related or foreign policy related was seen through the prism of the state needs. So for example, we were concerned mostly about preventing invasion, right? Or wars with major powers, things like Soviet Union or Russia were concerned. So these issues are still there. For example, rise of China. It's a nation state, and it generates policy thinking. We have to react somehow to that, right? Or resurgence of Russia. So these issues are still there that are traditional, come from the 20th century. But in addition to that, a lot of foreign policy analysts today argue that there is a whole host of so-called non-traditional or non-state-centric issues that are coming up that will be on the agenda moving forward, and perhaps even occupy more of our attention and time than these traditional state-centric. So China and Russia will still be a focus, no question about that. And by the way, foreign policy goes both ways. When I talk about our foreign policy concerns, Russians have the same thing, right? For them, United States is a challenge. For Chinese, the same way. So keep that perspective in mind. Foreign policy is not a prerogative of the United States only, right? So again, in addition to that, a lot of analysts argue there will be these asymmetric, non-traditional challenges. For example, non-state security threats. And some of it is already high on the agenda, things like terrorism, however defined. That's a very loaded term. Insurgencies. These are going to be threats that will require our foreign policy attention, but they're not stemming from states, right? Some of them are, like state-sponsored terrorism, but a lot of them are not. So we'll have to deal with them. So that's one on the agenda. Things like cybersecurity. With the advent of technology, There's an interesting, curious debate that a lot of the challenges that can be presented to the United States, for example, do not necessarily have to come from states anymore. Individuals these days have a capacity to challenge states. This was not the case in the 20th century, roughly speaking, right? But the advent of technology has this very interesting equalizing power, so to speak, where individuals or collection of individuals or non-state entities, groups, cartels, crime cartels, terrorist groups can mount a successful challenge to the state. It's not going to be a completely equal challenge, right? I mean, nobody can match the potential, the power of states like China or US, but enough to gain attention and kind of steer our foreign policy. So that's another thing. Cyber threats, environmental issues, for example, are thought to be high on the agenda as we move into this uncharted territory when it comes to global warming, environmental change. And what makes these particularly fascinating is because we know that we cannot solve this on any individual state level, which means our foreign policy has to shift towards some sort of a collaboration or cooperation. Clean Air Act. I mean, we know that the research indicates that up to a third of the air in California, for example, state of California, is polluted from foreign sources. We can even pinpoint East Asia, industrialization in China, countries like Vietnam, South Korea, all that air is flowing here, right? And you cannot block air. You cannot say, hey, air, dirty air, you don't have visa to enter the United States. These political things that we've developed do not work, right? So the United States has to do some sort of collaborative. And that's an interesting pivot in foreign policy as well. And we think it will have an impact. So again, to recap, in terms of the challenges into the future, the discussion is that in addition to these traditional state-centric challenges and shifts, we will have these non-traditional, non-state-centric threats like environment, cyber, crime, human trafficking, terrorism, that will be taking more and more attention away, I think, in our foreign policy, away from the traditional state-centric concerns. That would be my answer to keep an eye on.
Yeah, thanks. And staying on foreign policy, there's a bit of an elephant in the room with the tariffs, how they've been constantly changing. What impact will these new tariff policies have on the US's relations with other countries, or what impact have they already had?
So from a purely political science, political economy perspective, a huge impact, and we already see it, right? It's a tool. Tariff is just another tool in the toolkit. So if we kind of remove our personal biases and thinking about what it is, it's a legitimate tool. United States is not the only one that uses it. All the other countries, in fact, it is seen as a legitimate tool, in fact, to achieve foreign policy goals. I mean, foreign policy is simply defined as an attempt for one nation to get other nation to do something that they would not do otherwise, right? So you can either force them, use military force, for example, to do that, to get them to do something. You can influence them, the so-called soft power, right? Or you can use tools like tariffs, which is kind of in that gray area. It's in a way to force somebody to get it. So from that perspective, from a purely political science, international relations perspective, there is no controversy about tariffs at all. But in the context of domestic politics, it obviously becomes, it strides that partisan issue. And for that reason, it becomes controversial. Although I ask students usually to be very critical and look at it. The same tariffs that, for example, Trump administration imposed in the first term when he came into power, he opened his first presidency with the salvo of tariffs on washers and dryers. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know why and how, but Trump was hung up on these tariffs on washers and dryers. A huge amount of tariffs were imposed, but then Biden came in and he never revoked any of them, right? And it kind of went quiet. I mean, it was a little bit awkward, a little bit embarrassing, but Democrats loved what Trump did in terms of the tariffs. At least, I mean, they didn't publicly, but nobody scrapped any of those, right? And then Trump came in the second term and the second salvo, right? So he's doing that. So tariffs in that sense have a huge impact on foreign policy, no doubt, because it's a tool. And particularly in the hands of a powerful country like the United States, It does. And then there are numbers. So the trade has slowed down quite a bit, all the numbers indicate. So that's an impact. But at the same time, revenue shot up. The United States, in 6 months since the beginning of this year, has collected something like 22, the numbers, $1 billion. It's a huge amount, right? So these are the things that are not thrown every day. But so the short question you answer is the tariffs are a very effective tool, and countries, all countries, often use them. So in that case, United States is an exception.
Then just going back a bit to our discussion on birthright citizenship, what effects will a policy change here have on the US and on other countries? And what countries could give us a good comparative government lesson on the issue of birthright citizenship?
I am, I often invoke the fact that I have this luxury of just jumping off whenever I teach American government. I think it's a luxury. I can just proclaim and say, "Hey, I'm an outsider, so I don't have a dog in the fight," right? Even though I may have, but it gives me a good cover, I think, to jump off and then see the debate. So in that sense, this birthright citizenship thing is almost uniquely American thing. Very few countries around the world. I think there are only less than 5 countries, maybe less than a dozen for sure, who practice this thing. So for me, who grew up and accustomed to an idea where citizenship is not a birthright thing, um, it's fascinating to observe that it is a controversial thing at all. I mean, most of the rest of the world um, simply does not get this idea that just simply by being born in the country, you are guaranteed a citizenship. For those of you in the United States who do not know this comparative perspective, it's taken for granted, and then removing it may sound outrageous. I get that. However, from the global perspective, there is nothing controversial about it. It's actually most of the people would support this idea that the birthright citizenship should not be the case. Um, so in that sense, so that's the comparative perspective to you. Now, what kind of an impact it will have it, you obviously have to take the local American context to it. Americans are used to this concept, to this idea. It's a constitutional right for many people, right? Although it's subject to interpretation, but so far, historically, it has been interpreted as anybody born in this country. And when you're used to that, and then you have the discussion of removing that, I can totally see how outrageous and backward and unacceptable this can be. So from that perspective, it will have a huge impact as well. But you should keep that comparative perspective in mind. I think it's very interesting that the United States is very unique in granting citizenship this way.
Yeah, there's definitely it's come up a few times that a lot of the policies that have come up in the past couple months that we think are outrageous are kind of normal on the global scale.
Completely. I mean,
Is there kind
the
of
other thing is the border control, right? I initially, when this issue came up, again, I'm an internationalist comparativist, right? I was really, I had to dig in and try to understand why is this controversial to build up the wall. Um, and I understand now. I mean, I've done a little bit of a homework. I certainly can get, but you have to understand the local context. For outsiders who do not have the local politics and context, it is really lost on them. Why is this controversial to secure the border? At the national level, this is not an issue in Russia, in China, or any other country. This is not an issue at all. Building up a border is a bipartisan, everybody gets behind. But if it's a two-party system, right? But it's not a national controversy. You know, you cannot build a political career by arguing against building up a border. So this is another thing. But again, the beauty of teaching international politics, so inserting international politics to give you this comparative perspective as well. But this national debate that's going on with border or birthright citizenship is very, hard to understand overseas, in my view.
Then shifting gears slightly, so the U.S. has been experiencing some dips in tourism lately. So I just wanted to ask how tourism affects the U.S.'s GDP and how much tourism affects other countries' wealth and development.
Oh, this is interesting. So my knowledge on this is as good as next person who reads the current events, right? So some of the numbers are there. Tourism is apparently dropping down. So it directly answers to your question is it will have an impact. Obviously, America is the most visited country in the world. More people visit the United States on an annual basis, at least used to, than any other country. At the same time, so that speaks volumes, right? That means tourism is quite big in absolute terms. A lot of people come in here, spend money. But at the same time, United States is not a tourism dependent country, right? It's very well diversified. In other words, if tourism flags, unlike some other countries like Thailand, for example, right, or Turkey, or Italy, even some of the compare where tourism is a huge chunk of revenue generation, national level revenue generation for those countries. United States is not at that level of dependence. So it pinches. I mean, certainly, especially the sectors of the economy that are geared towards tourism, they will feel an impact and the drop if it continues and if it's persistent, if it's beyond a temporary dip, right? It looks like it may be studies showing that it may be more consistent than kind of a scare moment. So in that case, those sectors will feel. But the nation as a whole, right? The economy is pretty well diversified. It doesn't hinge or depend on tourism. So from that perspective, nation is very well shielded, I think, from. So in other words, you cannot scare Trump by saying, hey, if you do this, tourism is going to plunge and it's going to be bad for the economy. It's not going to impact, I think it's not going to impact him at that level. So it's not going to be that magnitude effect. So that would be my answer. It will impact, but not as much.
Then, kind of going across the pond for a second, there have been some anti-tourism protests lately in Europe, especially in Spain and Italy, and there's been some reforms regarding that. So, what impact do you think will adjusting the tourism industry in tourism-dependent countries have versus around here?
I've read those things and they tend to be so it's a flip side of this, right? So I was mostly when I was answering the previous question, I was mostly thinking the United States as the receiving end of tourism, right? But we also should keep in mind that Americans is it's the biggest tourist group in the world, right? And this summer alone, Americans saved Europe. That was a bunch of the headlines that it is really the Americans visiting Europe that helped Europeans to weather this economic crisis. For not all, but some of, especially the Mediterranean countries, Greece particularly has been flagged as if it wasn't for American tourists, the country, this economy would percent. So there's that impact as well. So anti-tourism from, let's say, Europeans, right, is a tricky proposition because on the one hand, it is it's not overtly anti-American protest. So a lot of these cities just don't want too many visitors in their towns, right? A lot of them happen to be American. So in that sense, anti-tourism is not necessarily anti-American, but it's a double-edged sword. A lot of these places also depend on revenue from tourism. So it's hard for me to kind of suggest a policy proposition for them, but anybody who is analyzing these tendencies and these dynamics should be aware that tourism generates a lot of revenue, and then it's really up to these nations to decide whether they want it or not. But the power of the purse for from the Americans is undeniably there.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
Can I ask the question to the panel, especially the students? I'd be very, very curious to think to know what you think about the following question that I want to ask. So it's obviously a very heightened situation, right? What's the term? We are polarized. I think that's the term. We are polarized beyond. Do you guys see, I think this is a little bit just to nudge your thinking, anything positive out of the current administration's agenda? Do you guys think there is something that he or this administration is doing that will benefit the national interests? Because I know the agenda is generally that it is negative, right? And I agree for a large extent. But is there anything that you see that's happening positive for the American national interest in this climate? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have a direct single thing that I think
Right.
that would be good, but frankly, I'm so deeply entrenched in a echo chamber that if he did have policies that would be have wide sweeping benefits to the country, I might not know about them because the sources of media that I draw from and on social media and etc. It's all one sided. So, well, I don't think I know any single one policy that may just be as a result of the ideological entrenchment that's
Fair
all
enough.
around us in media and social media.
And that seems it's not, I mean, what you bring up a larger point that everybody is in echo chambers mostly, right? On the left and right. So, good point. But anything else? You know, eh, no?
I can add a little. It's definitely since I live in the DC area, having the whole uh Doge is just it's just hugely impacting so many aspects of our daily life inside the Beltway. But then Trump does have the push in his administration to kind of spread some of the power outside of just the DC area.
Okay.
And so around here, there can be a little bit of a panic where it's like everyone's like, oh, the jobs are moving away from right here, but it does help make sure that
Oh, very
some of
good.
that
So
power
selling
is
is
in other
actually
places of the country. So I think that can actually provide some benefits. And
very good, very good. Yeah, and in fact, I may use that to begin. Well, I was thinking in the broader terms, not specifically policy, but I've never seen so much interest in politics from particularly younger people, right? And I think one hidden benefit of all the controversies that are going on right now would be the involvement of younger people into politics. Maybe because some of the things are outrageous and whatever it is, it's getting to the young people, right? It's involving them, and it's kind of a broader project of this entity as well, of our organization, right? It's our to use this moment and to um, get the younger generation, people like yourselves, right, to think about these issues, to get involved, be critical in the assessments, and from that perspective, this polarized world, I think the polarized, even though it comes with huge costs, that it comes on the at the expense of immigration, at the expense of vulnerable populations. But if you would like to see a silver kind of lining, I think is highly politically charged and ready and kind of energized younger generation, and that I think is a benefit that I wanted to highlight of what's going on. And it's also globally and internationally. United States is becoming kind of a inspiration for the rest of the world as well. But just the nature of this country is just too big, right? When we internally sneeze, the rest of the world catches cold, right? So in that respect as well, I think globally it is inspiring a lot of people to get involved in politics as well. There is something called Trump bump in political science major, for example. People are kind of expressing interest. They are picking political science as a major as well. Uh,
Political science and psychology.
okay, it's like
Those are
I
the
can
two
see.
majors that have had a Trump bump.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah. He has an educative effect.
that's
That's
right. That's what I
that's a
meant to say.
positive.
Yeah,
It's an
I
educative
didn't mean to
effect.
ask, oh, what is it that
Yeah,
Trump is doing that's good? It's
yeah,
maybe a very hard
yeah.
argument to make, but the broader impact of
Mhm.
of this period in point, I think, is gives hope.
Well, we are running out of time again, but I want to thank Dr. McCuan and Dr. Sakiev. I want to thank Chris. I want to thank Felix. And I think this was a really good opportunity to, talk on just factual sides of everything that's going on and having a domestic and an international and comparative perspective. I think that's really helpful. As Felix said, a lot of us are in our own echo chamber of what we follow and who our friends or who our family are. And it can be hard sometimes to step outside of that based on algorithms and what's showing up for us if we're not purposefully seeking that out. So I really appreciate this, and I think it kind of goes back to to me on a whole different topic of a lot of people think that we're at the university levels, people are becoming that professors are preaching their beliefs. And I mean, you guys are clearly not doing that as professors. And so I thank you. And I hope that other Americans, young and those who are adults who are voting can see, you guys as examples of it's about making people think. And that's what education is having that critical thinking skill set. And that's the purpose of education, right? And so thank you for being great examples for that for us today.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of civic impact, right? Students for civic impact.